Now in its second year, the Poynter Medal for Lifetime Achievement is awarded by the Institute's Board of Trustees in recognition of the outstanding career achievements of a journalist or a member of the media whose work has made a lasting impact, serving citizens in our democracy. I can't think of a more deserving recipient than tonight's honoree. Tom Brokaw is an icon in broadcast journalism, one of the most accomplished journalists of this generation or any generation. He's also a uniquely American success story. His roots are humble. He was born in Webster, South Dakota. His dad was a construction foreman, his mom a post office clerk. His career began at a small TV station in Sioux City, Iowa. In just a few short years, Tom Brokaw's superb journalistic talents, authoritative on-air presence, and distinctive deep voice landed him a spot at NBC News in 1966 in the Los Angeles Bureau. Over the next 50 years, Tom Brokaw would win every major award in broadcast journalism, multiple Emmys, Peabodys, and DuPonts. He's the only journalist to host all three NBC News programs, Today, the Nightly News, which he anchored for 22 years, and briefly Meet the Press. All along the way, he's been the trusted eyes and ears for Americans at the most historic events of the last half-century: Watergate, the fall of the Berlin Wall, 9/11, and many others. His 1998 book, The Greatest Generation, depicting the heroism and sacrifices of those who came of age during the Great Depression and World War II, was one of the best-selling books of the 20th century. 2 years ago, President Barack Obama awarded him the Medal of Freedom, the highest civilian honor. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my very distinct honor and high privilege tonight to award the 2016 Poynter Medal for Lifetime Achievement in Journalism to one of the great broadcast journalists of all time and a true American success story, Mr. Tom Brokaw.
We're making him work for it a little bit.
Well, I want to say something to my friend, my new friend, Mr. Tokley. Mr. Tokley, you did me proud, as you could tell from the reaction of the crowd. But I am so grateful to my family you did not go, because their reaction would have been, Tom, the greatest? Ho, ho, ho.
Mr. Brokaw was generous enough to spend some time with us here, talking on stage about perhaps some of the things that are currently in the news, about the media, and maybe some of the past, because you have had a remarkable career, a hero to someone like myself who works in television, and a lot of print people here today, but you have always been one of my heroes, and it's an honor for me to be sitting here chatting with you tonight. Yesterday, we learned about the passing of astronaut John Glenn. You were on the Today show this morning talking about that. You described him as the quintessential American hero. We talked a little bit. I had the pleasure of meeting John Glenn briefly, but you knew him pretty well.
I knew him quite well. In fact, I was just with him now a little more than 2 years ago. Well, less than 2 years ago. He was developing molecular degeneration. He couldn't see. It was heartbreaking. I didn't know that until I got there, and he took me aside and he said, "You have to help me through this day." He had had 20/20 eyesight until he was 88 or 89 years of age. He was one of the great pilots in the history of American military. And he was that quintessential small town, middle American guy who met his wife when they were in side-by-side cribs, and they lived their whole life together. He was an athlete. He was a Boy Scout, Eagle Scout. He was also he played in the band. Then he went to the Marines. He fought in World War II, fought in Korea. Ted Williams, who didn't have much good to say about a lot of other people about almost anything, said he was his wingman, and he said he was the finest leader and the finest flyer I have ever worked with. So I've often said that if Norman Rockwell were going to draw the quintessential American hero, the one that we should all look up to, it would be John Glenn.
We saw a little bit on the video clip a moment ago. You landed what had to be your biggest scoop of your career, perhaps 27 years ago last month. We're talking about your reporting from the Berlin Wall, the wall toppling around you. You were there reporting live, and no one else was really doing that. How did you manage to land that assignment and be at the right place at the right time?
Well, it was total perception. I understood that the wall didn't happen quite that way. I had a very good colleague at NBC News, and Jerry Lamprecht was his name. He was our foreign editor. And on Monday, he said, not much going on in America these days. He said, it's beginning to roil in East Germany. Why don't you go over there and do a couple of stories and then come home? We'll order a satellite in case anything happens. So I flew overnight. It was a hotly competitive business. We didn't want Dan or Peter to know that I was leaving to go to Germany. So I flew overnight, and the next day I showed up in East Germany, and it was vibrant, but it was not at critical mass. So I said, we don't need the satellite tonight. I'll do my reporting on pre-tape. The next day, one of my very good colleagues in Europe had arranged an interview with Günter Schabowski. Günter Schabowski was the propaganda chief for the East. I went back into the East again, and you could tell there was a lot of tension and turmoil, but I didn't think it was going to result in what it did, this historic moment. 5 o'clock in the afternoon, we all go to a news conference with Günter Schabowski, who was a typical leaden bureaucrat from the East, very filled with himself. And about halfway through the news conference, somebody gave him a piece of paper, and he read it. He said, the Politburo has decided that members of the GDR, German Democratic Republic, can go through any portal in the wall and then return through the same portal or any other. I had a camera crew from Germany who had lived there all of their lives, and they looked at me, and I was sitting next to the AP correspondent from Germany, and we banged our heads and said, did this come from Venus, or did it come from that man speaking for the German government? And it turns out that I had an appointment with him right after the news conference. I ran upstairs, and my colleague braced herself against the door to keep other reporters from getting in, and I made him read the statement again on camera to me. And I said, Mr. Schabowski, this means the wall is down. And he said, that means that they go out and then they can come back. They honestly believe that the East Germans would leave and then return to their old way of life. So I ran downstairs, and a number of my colleagues who were in the print press were reading this statement. We're all trying to figure it out, and I said, gentlemen, the wall is down. It had played out on East German television, that news conference. So by the time I got to Checkpoint Charlie, where they'd always given us a bad time going in, the guard was waving us through, and I got out and I said, did you hear the announcement? Through our interpreter, and he's da. And I said, what do you think? And he said back through the interpreter, I'm not paid to think, keep going. So I called New York. We had the only satellite path available. Not even Germany had a satellite path. In those days, it was harder to order them. Now you can get them at a moment's notice. And we set up shop at the Brandenburg Gate. And then it was clear that the people may not be coming through the wall, by the time we went on the air, we'd made this big promise that the wall was down. And at a bridge, the Bronheimer Bridge, the guards were almost ready to shoot the East Germans who had gathered there, saying, "Let us through." And the reason they didn't shoot is a matter of conscience, and they didn't have any orders because everybody in the Politburo in East Germany had gone home and gone to bed. They didn't have any idea about what was going on. It was midnight at that time. And then they did come through. And it was the most exhilarating time of my career. The funny story is that if you look at that picture, I'm wearing a very handsome blue top coat. I'm a big outdoorsman, so I'd taken one of my scruffy jackets over there because it was going to be cold. And I looked down at myself about 5 minutes before we went on the air, and I thought, this is going to be on television forever. And I turned to my colleague, Mike Betcher, who had just come from London, and he was bragging about this beautiful cashmere topcoat he bought. And I said, "Mike, give me your damn topcoat right now." He did. I wore it. And we had this wonderful exchange. He now teaches at the University of Oklahoma. I went out there last year to do a seminar on all of this, and he had his topcoat wrapped and packaged for me. And I anticipated this, and I had Under Armour make him an all-red Oklahoma Go Sooners hoodie with Berlin Wall, December 9th, 1989. So it worked out.
Excellent story. Excellent story. It almost goes without saying, you've done a remarkable job of raising the American consciousness about the contribution of our veterans and their families. In your book, The Greatest Generation, you wrote, "It is, I believe, the greatest generation any society has ever produced." Explain why you make that kind of a broad statement.
Well, it came to me. This was something that evolved over a period of time. I'm 76 years old. I was born in 1940. So my first memories of life are of that war. I was like coming up on 3. We were living on an Army base in southwestern South Dakota where everybody was going to war, coming home from war. They were detonating ordnance out in the alkaline desert of South Dakota. And it formed my whole early childhood. And then the war came to an end. And my parents, like everybody else in that generation, had had a very difficult time during the Depression. They worked very hard. They saved their money. They ran from job to job just to try to put things together. I lived in a 2-wheel trailer with my parents, and then in an old family hotel in which they had a restroom, a bathroom at the end of the hall and one light bulb. And my parents never complained about that. And then suddenly the war ends, and my dad got a wonderful job for his working class skills on a big project in central South Dakota building an enormous dam. They began to think, we're going to send this son to college. We can buy our first new car. 1950 Chevrolet. I always remember, my God, my dad spent $1,700 for a new car. I just couldn't believe it. And then we moved to a larger town, and they bought their first house. We'd always lived in rental houses or in more modest circumstances. That house was $11,000. And it was 3 bedrooms, not very big inside, but it was a corner lot. And we had working class prosperity. And so I went on to college, and I went on to my career, and I kind of put those hard times behind me. On the 40th anniversary of D-Day, I went to do a documentary on what had happened 40 years earlier. My thinking was, I was training for a marathon. You know, I'm going to do a lot of running in the hills where you have great seafood. I had a great crew with me. Be a good time. And on the first day we were there, I walked on Omaha Beach. And on Omaha Beach, I met 2 men from the Big Red One. They were tiny. Well, people forget this. If you look at the induction pictures from the war, guys had their ribs sticking out. They didn't have enough to eat every day. And when I would say to them, what do you remember about basic training? They'd say, oh my God, I never had a breakfast like that. I got my first new pair of boots or new pair of trousers. And these 2 guys, I said, what happened? They said, ramp went down right over there, first wave. And as the ramp went down, our first sergeant and our lieutenant were shot through the head and they were killed. We were 19 years old. We'd been through basic training and that was it. We got onto the beach terrified. We were down behind a tank trap. When a colonel came running down the beach, I later found out who he was. He did this deliberately. He leaned over them and he said, men, there are 2 kinds of people on this beach, the dead and those about to be dead. You got to keep moving. So they got to the top of the bridge, and they agreed that they would take this war a day at a time. One of them earned the Medal of Honor, and the other one lost both legs in the war, but they came back to productive lives here. I was so emotionally roiled by that first 2 hours with them, standing off to the side with their wives, clutching their purses, and they had plastic headdresses on against the rainy season. I went to a little tiny cafe, and a man came over to me, and you'll know who he was, and he said, "Tom, Sam Gibbons from Florida." And I said, "Well, of course, Congressman, how are you? What are you doing here?" He said, "I was here 40 years ago." And he pulled out a brass clicker that the 82nd Airborne had. He said, "We jumped in." I said, "Can you talk about it?" And he said, "Well, I never have." And he started to talk about it. And his tears streamed down his face. And his wife came over and said to me, "I've never heard these stories." And it was a harrowing story. He thought the invasion had failed because they didn't see anybody coming. He put together a small squad up and down fighting the Germans. Then he went on, as you well know, to a very distinguished career in politics and representing this part of Florida in the Congress of the United States. And I went back to America deeply moved and shaken by this, and I began collecting these stories. And on the 50th anniversary, I was on the Today Show, and I thought about what I wanted to say, and Katie asked me what I made of all this, and I said, survived the Depression, won the war, greatest war in the history of mankind, came back and built the America we have today. I think it's the greatest generation any society has ever produced. Stephen Ambrose, the great World War II historian, was a friend of mine, and he was there, and he slapped me on the back, and he said, "Brokaw, if you don't write that, I'm going to." And I said, "Okay." And I was already at work on it, so I wrote it. And, you know, there were people who were critical of it, and I said, look, they weren't all perfect. But I think as a whole, they were the greatest generation. My wife and I were talking just last night, because it came up again with John Glenn, not in anything I said, but almost all the accounts said he was symbolic of the greatest generation, or he was representative of the greatest generation. He was personification of the greatest generation. It's become part of our language. And I suppose that in the long haul of all the things I've been privileged to do in journalism, that will be right near the top, that I coined that phrase, the greatest generation. And it became part of how we think of them, because we had not been thinking about them until I wrote the book.
And a little side note, you're not finished with any of that, because he's going out to talk to Tom Hanks, you're working, he's touring, there's more to come on this. But I'd like to ask you about something else. Now that this 2016 election, this presidential election is behind us, some are suggesting...
Oh, wait a minute, you mean there was an election?
Yeah, somebody...
I
remember seeing you at the convention, I'm pretty sure you were there, both of us. But some have suggested that we've entered what's called a post-fact era, where people no longer seem to care about whether the information they get is real, that what matters most to them, that it kind of goes along with what they feel and what they're hearing, what they're seeing, and what they agree with, probably more than that. How do you respond to this suggestion that we are in a post-fact era?
Well, I think that's an interesting way of putting it. I think it's a combination of things. I had felt very strongly throughout, in the lead up to this election and then during the campaign, that the country was angrier than everybody realized. I would quote a friend of mine who was a river runner in the West, and he would talk about difficult clients, and he would say they're half-cocked in the ticked-off position, although he didn't say ticked off, by the way. And I think that's where the country was. What I also thought was one of the most important developments in our life about where we get information, how we use it, how we vet it, is social media. I thought that was the great new form of people getting their opinions, getting their news, and it's not very reliable. I mean, there's a lot of room for mischief. You've been reading a lot about about fake news. I thought she was not running a good campaign. I thought the country wanted change. She was not offering change. She was offering kind of the same old, same old. I did not think she would lose, because I thought at the end, and the country was not in love with either one of them. I thought in the final 2 weeks, his demeanor and his deportment would cost him the election. That the way he talked about women, for example, how he treated people, how he didn't have, very detailed answers about stuff. And I was wrong with almost everyone else as well. That night, when it began to look like this was going to be closer, at about 7:30 or 8 o'clock, Chuck and I looked at each other and thought this could go to him. Katie Tour, who covers him, was the only one at NBC who thought that he could win because she was seeing those crowds all the time. Now we're in a new phase. Now we're in that interim between his election and when he takes office. And a number of people have said to me tonight, what's going to happen? I don't know. I will share with you my best principle for covering politics, whether at the elective stage of it or in the governing part of it. I call it the UFO theory. The unforeseen will occur. That was certainly true of this election. It will be true going forward. I'm going to write something next week that I think a lot of people have not thought about. There was so much excitement. I was 20 years old at the time when John Kennedy got elected. We thought, best and brightest, they're going to bring the best people into Washington. What was the first thing that happened? He authorized a plan that had been being worked up by the CIA, and it was to invade Cuba. And it was a disaster. It was a terrible decision. And then right after that, he went to Vienna to meet with Khrushchev, Nikita Khrushchev of the Soviet Union. Khrushchev had seen this young man make that call on Cuba, and he took his head off. And Kennedy came out of there deeply shaken, saying it was brutal. Same time, Kennedy appointed Robert McNamara, who had been a kind of ordnance genius during World War II, to run Vietnam. And he led us deeper and deeper into Vietnam. What saved the Kennedy presidency before his assassination was that he learned from those experiences. When the Bay of Pigs came along, he didn't let the generals run the show, that he made the decisions about, we're going to try to negotiate our way out of this. Obviously, Khrushchev was testing him. He looked at him in Vienna in the eye and thought, he's a young man, he doesn't know what he's doing. And he tested him by putting those ICBMs in Cuba. And Kennedy saved his presidential reputation, if you will, right before he was assassinated by staring down the generals and working out a diplomatic solution to it and not giving up anything for America. That's a perfect example of the expectations that go in different directions. So we don't know what's going to happen with Donald Trump. We don't know where the first test will come from. We don't know about how the economy will respond to what he's doing. I remember 8 years ago when President Obama was going into office, I was on a panel with my colleagues, and I've been around longer, and they were saying, when is he going to know that he's president? And they were saying, well, when the butler in the morning says, Mr. President, it's time to get up. Or when he gets ready to go downstairs and the Secret Service contingent comes around, that's when he'll know he's president. I said, he'll know he's president when he sits down in the Oval Office and they give him the overnight foreign and security briefing about what's going on in the world. That's when you know you're president, because there are always unexpected developments. And for the next 4 years, these challenges will come through the window, under the door, through the transom. They'll come from unexpected places. And there are things now that are not on the horizon that this president-elect is going to have to deal with. He is our president-elect, and I personally hope that he does a very good job. And I hope that he'll learn from whatever early mistakes that he makes, and he will, because every new president does make those mistakes. And then for those who don't agree with what he's doing and can't believe that we've gotten to this place, you just can't get into a fetal position and say, oh my God, I didn't believe this would ever happen. If you don't like what happened, then you have to, for yourself and for your friends, you have to organize another way of governing the country. We are in a difficult situation. We have most of the population now on the East Coast and on the West Coast. And that big red band through the middle of America is an electoral powerhouse. The Electoral College means that those states that don't have the population can still elect presidents. And she's going to win, 2.5 million, maybe even as many as 3 million votes more than he did. And that doesn't mean we get rid of the Electoral College, but we've got to figure out a way that we can make that more representative of the whole country. And that's going to take the best interest of everybody to do it. It's not easy. It's complicated. But this is a great republic, a nation of laws, and people, as we've demonstrated every day since 9/11, are able to respond to great challenges and get it right. And I hope we do now.
I think a lot of us, those of us who work at NBC affiliates, and I'm sure especially at the network, miss Tim Russert and his, I'm just curious what he would be thinking about this election. It was 2008. I mean, you had to announce his passing. I know you guys were friends, you were close, but and you went through the whole 2000 election in Florida, for crying out loud. What would he think of
Florida. Yeah.
What would he have thought of this election?
What would Tim have thought of this election? Tim had a couple of phrases. This is big, Brooks. This is big, he'd always say to me. We were like brothers. So we grew up in very, very similar circumstances. Working class dads, came from working class households, had careers that we could never have anticipated at an early age. I think Chuck Todd has done a fantastic job on Meet the Press. And no one would have liked to have had Tim at his side more than Chuck would have during all of this. He was a genius at American politics. I'm not sure exactly what I think. His son and I have talked about this, Luke. Tim had never seen anything like this before. Tim, in his own politics, I can say this, he was a Moynihan guy. He worked for Moynihan, so he was a right-of-center Democrat growing up in Buffalo. But he was not an ideologue. He didn't, tie into one party or the other just based on the ideology. He was always a pragmatic guy. Very faithful Catholic. He was Jesuit educated. And I said to him one day, Timmy, if you decided not to do this and you'd gone to the clergy, you would have been a cardinal. And he said, Brokaw, I wouldn't have stopped a cardinal. I'd have been a pope. So we miss him every day.
One final.
May I do one thing very quickly here?
Please.
I've had this adventurous life. I've been all over the world in wars, covering them in Beirut and Somalia and Iraq and Afghanistan and Central America. And one of my most memorable occasions was in Afghanistan. I went to a special forces base in a valley called Deh, which is north of Kandahar. And it was a triangle that they built. These are very small teams that operate at night against the bad guys and then by day try to build power facilities and clean water and medical facilities for the locals. And I was extremely well taken care of by the best special forces officer in Afghanistan that year. And he's in this audience tonight, and his name is Colby Jenkins, and his wife is Heather, and I'd like them to stand up and we give them a recognition.
What time?
I liked him for a lot of reasons. He kept me alive, and he also let me shoot their weapons out on the range, so I like that.
Time for one more question before we let you go. Look in the crystal ball if you can. I know it's difficult to do as a journalist here, but what will be the story 1 year from tonight, do you think?
A year ago, we would not have said it was we would not have said that it was Donald Trump winning the presidency. Just no one would have said that. That was the UFO theory that came true. I think the story, it's very hard to say. We all have hopes that we can get this economy back in pretty good order, that we can get the federal budget working in the right way. I think if the Democrats have not reorganized themselves in a year, that will be a big story, that they're failing their party in terms of responding to what the country wants. If they do get themselves together and they have some victories, then a big story will be that the Democrats are on the comeback trail, and we'll see where it goes. But there will be 1,000 other big stories between now and then. I'll give you 2 or 3 to think about. The Chinese are sitting back analyzing Donald Trump, and when he called Taiwan the other day, they said to themselves, we're not going to do business with this guy. You know, we have a two-China policy now. They're building sea lanes from South China through the South China Sea all the way to the Middle East. They're going to step that up. They're going to try to have a big sea lane of commerce and military presence over there. I don't know what Putin's going to do, but I know he's going to do something. You know, the story was when George Bush, 43, said he looked in his eyes and saw the soul of a Christian. It's one of the few things I agree with Dick Cheney on, even though I've known him a long time. Cheney said, I looked in his eyes and saw an old KGB agent. That's what I see when I look at him. So I think Russia will try to be a much bigger player between now and then. What I also know is that a year from now, that this country will still be the greatest country in the world, that we'll still do things from the ground up that no other country can do. The genius of us surviving the economic tough times is the managerial skills from Main Street to Wall Street in America. The people who come wanting to run businesses, want to be more enterprising. Silicon Valley was invented here. It's changing the world unlike any other technology ever has. I just spent last Saturday with Bill Gates. I'm getting ready for my 50th year of NBC. We're doing a big special. And I went to see Bill very early when he was known, but not well known, because I could see what he was up to was going to change the world profoundly, and we've stayed in touch since then. He has a $40 billion charity. That's $40 billion that he has spent. He knows where every dime went. He knows what the polio rates are in the most obscure sections of India. $40 billion of his own money, and he's still the richest man in the world because he made a lot of money during all that time. Heavily invested with Jackie Ma and Alibaba in China, for example. We have a lot of brilliant people in this country, more of them at a younger age or more entrepreneurial than they ever have been. My generation got in line. They stood in line at IBM, or they stood in line at a bank and waited their turn. I chose television broadcast journalism in part because they were so eager to get people, you could kind of make your way very quickly. This generation doesn't do that. They look for opportunities all day, every day to change the world. They change their jobs on average between the ages of 21 and 32 6 times because they're always looking for something new to do, and they have changed almost everything. I kind of keep track of that in an informal way. So that's the vibrancy of this country. You know, I've been coming to Florida for a long time, and it's an amazing place about how it's grown up out of the swampy lands and what it's become. On the other hand, in the Great Plains, South Dakota, there was a lot of rural poverty when I was growing up. Farms were small and not very profitable. Farms now are 20,000 acres, and they're dealing with Chinese buyers on soybeans and sunflowers. Sioux Falls, South Dakota is a town of, when I was growing up, with 78,000 people, the biggest town I went to play basketball against. Now it's 220,000. Unemployment is 1.9%. So there are a lot of good things going on out there, and we just need to build on them one after the other. So I do think that we'll be okay. I want to leave you with one journalistic story. One of the reasons I'm in journalism and have stayed in journalism is that I love the people that I work with. They're not regimented. They really take no prisoners when they go off and do their jobs. They try to find a new way of doing things and discovering things. And they've made great colleagues. One of them is Sam Donaldson. When I got sick with cancer, I had a most wonderful note from Sam, and we've been friends for a long time. And you can almost hear his voice. He said, "Thomas, I know what you're thinking. Why me? Better question is, why not you? You're at the right age to get cancer. I got cancer," and I said, "Why me?" And then I realized I had it coming. I've been around for a long time. Sam, his motor never runs down. It never runs down. And one of the most memorable nights, we were in Brussels and Belgium, and we'd been on a 5-day presidential trip with no sleep, and everybody was in the hotel lobby just kind of draped over the chairs, exhausted. And it was 2 in the morning, and Sam comes barreling through the lobby. He's got a comment for everybody. You know, what are you up to, Marty? What's going on here? Helen, when are you going to be on the air? And then he goes off against the elevator. I'll see you all in the morning. And somebody turned to one of my colleagues and said, what would Sam have done if they had not invented television? And my friend said, he would have gone door to door, actually. Thank you all very much.
Legendary newsman, Tom Brokaw. It's a pleasure. Congratulations on your award tonight.